Okay, so we got our user controls working. So what we want to do now, we're going to do a couple things. We're going to look at adding a master page and how can we then change our default page to use the master page. And then we also should hopefully have time to implement some basic CSS and play around with the validation. Then you'll have everything you need to do the assignment. So we'll create a basic master page. I'll just click on my project, right click, choose add new item. And what we want is a web forms master page. So when I select that template, it's down near the bottom. It'll give it a .master extension. I'm going to change the name. I'll call it lesson 4.master. It'll add it to the project. Now it looks mostly like a regular ASPX file, except you'll notice two differences, right? Two other tags on there. Not the nested one. Just a regular master file. So it sets out a full HTML template, but there's an ASP content placeholder in the header, and then there's a content placeholder in the main body. We can have as many of these content placeholders as we want, so this is where our dynamic content goes. And notice also it has a built-in server-side form tag. So if we're going to build pages that use our master, our individual pages don't need a form tag. The form tag can live on the master file instead. So maybe on here we'll just put in heading lesson 4. It is, but I'm going to go, it's week 4 on the schedule, so I'm going to refer to this, everything as lesson 4. Next week will be 5 because it's the 5th week. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to build a new page that will use the master page, and then we're going to change our default page, which doesn't use the master, to include it. So I'm going to right-click my project, choose Add New Item. And this time, rather than just making a regular web form, which will give us a full HTML template, we want a web form with master page. So the HTML at the top and bottom are going to come from our master page instead of coming directly from the ASPX file. So I'll choose web form using master page, and we're going to call this page tip.aspx. And after we add it, Visual Studio recognizes, oh, you want to use a master page. Okay, here's a list of all the .master files in the solution. So which master page is providing the template for this page? So you notice, rather than get a full HTML template with doc type, head, title, and body, our tip page doesn't have those things because they all are going to come from here instead. They're going to come from the master page file. So we'll add a couple things into the master page file. We'll add a simple header and footer, and then we'll run it all and see how it all works. So if we go back to our master page, above my form, doesn't really matter whether this goes in or above the form, I'm going to put in a nav tag. And in here, we'll put in a very simple navigation bar with a couple of links. So our first link will go to default. It'll say home. And our second link will go to tip.aspx. And the text of that link will say tip calculator. So this goes above our main content section. If we wanted to have dynamic content above the nav, well, we can. And then down below my form, we'll put on a footer tag We can just put any text in the footer, doesn't matter. So because our tip page is using the master as the template, any HTML we put in the master page will automatically get rendered on tip. Kyle?
Does that need to be inside tags, or just be inside the footer tag?
It's inside the footer tag, so that's an HTML5 tag. We also could have used a div tag and put div ID equals footer. Same thing. So we've added some new files. In order to get those to load, we're going to need to recompile to get those files added to our DLL. So I'll build my solution. And I'll get mine restarted. I had stopped mine because I had run my debugger. So I'll start it without debugging.
Did you just add a footer? Is that the last thing you had now?
Yeah. So now we've got our header at the top, footer at the bottom, and it's loading my tip page. If I go back to home, we still get the old page. There's no master page applied to it. So we're missing the header and footer on default. Default was a standalone page with no template. So we're going to want to change default so it now also uses the master page, so the header and footer are going to be consistent. We can jump from one to the other. So if you notice what we have on our tip page, what we're going to have to do is make some changes to default so it more closely resembles this page. Right? We're going to strip out HTML at the bottom, and we're going to strip out HTML at the top, and instead we'll use those sections from our master page instead. So if we go back to default, the first thing we're going to have to change is up here in the very first line. Right? That's right. Who said master page file? You got it. So we've got a master page file declaration on our tip page. We don't have that right now on default. So we're going to have to, anywhere in this page declaration on line 1, add. So I just type MAS and equals, and Visual Studio will automatically recognize any .master files. So we can link to our master page this way. Now if I go back to my browser and try and run it this way, we're going to have issues, right? I can refresh this. Here's what we're going to get. The yellow error screen of death. Basically, if your page uses a master page, any content on the page has to live inside of one of those ASP content blocks. You can't put other text on your page or other HTML tags. So notice on tip, we've got the header content and we have the main content placeholder. So any HTML we want has to go inside of one of those or inside of any other ASP content block we want to add. So on our default page, we're going to take out, starting at our doc type, all the way down to here. Actually, I'm going to basically take out everything except our embedded ASCX and our radio button list. So if we want this stuff to show in the main section, below the header, but above the footer, we need to put on an ASP content panel. I give it any ID and run at equals server. And now we need to set the content placeholder ID. So where on the master page, which part of the master page is this section going to render as? So if I choose content placeholder ID, it now references the two content placeholders from the master page. Is it going in the head or is it going in the main section? I don't know why they didn't call this main. And when I close the tag, we'll need to move this closing tag all the way down to the bottom. I've left out the header ASP content because we don't actually have anything in the header on here. If we want custom code in the header, we could use that second ASP content block. So we've converted this one from a standard ASPX file now to using an ASPX file that uses a template. It's actually pretty rare nowadays to build ASPX files without a master page. Why would we? Most sites are going to include common elements, at the very minimum, headers and footers. So we're probably going to want to include them. If I refresh default now, we get our header and footer. We can jump back and forth. And each page is using our master. Now we get to do our page load order of operation. So now we've got 3 page load events, right? We've got the page name, default or tip. We've got the master file it's using. And we've got, on the default page, we also have the ASCX control that's embedded. So which one's going to run first? We know the page event runs before the controls load event. Where in the sequence do you think master is going to run? Will it run before the page or after the page but before the controls? Do you think it'll be first? Well, let's try it and see. So put on a breakpoint in my master file, put a breakpoint back in my ASCX control, and we'll put one on default. I'll start my active debugging. Oops. So first we get the page, the ASPX files first. Then we get the master page, and then we get the user control at the end. So the ASPX file will always be first, the master page will always be second. So you can see if we have initialization code on all 3 of these, how debugging it can be tricky. Because we got to figure out what's happening in what order and where is that. Which page load event is triggering what? Just start it up again. So we can add our server-side script anywhere. It might belong on the master page, it might belong on an individual page, it might belong as part of our control. So typical things on the master page we might do would be something like permission checking. We need to have that happen on every page that uses that template. Well, rather than putting that code into every page, we could run it on page load of the master page. Every time the template loads, we're going to check authentication, roles, and permissions. So we only have to write that code and put it in one spot. And every page that inherits it will automatically draw from it. Any questions so far about the master page? The other small thing we want to do is let's add some basic CSS in here. So we could add our own. I'm just going to add Bootstrap, which I've put the link for you on Blackboard. So inside of Tools and Resources, which is your first folder in course documents, I will just copy it over for you right now. You might just have to refresh the Tools and Resources folder. Down at the bottom, here's the basic link to the Content Delivery Network. to get the minified Bootstrap, an optional theme in jQuery. We really only need the first link, but I'll grab all three. So I'm just going to copy those. So where in the solution should we put this? Yeah, let's put it in the head section of our master page. So I'll just paste those links in here. So if we refresh, or just reload now, we get some of the Bootstrap styling, and we can see it's at least changed the font, it's changed the color of the links. We could probably play around, you know, we could give our nav a class of yeah, we'd have to play around. I probably don't want to use that class. I have to play around a bit more with it. So if in here in our master page, for example, we wanted to give this a class of common Bootstrap class to hold our main content, we might use container. It'll move it over a bit, give us a bit of padding on the left. So we can play around with this stuff. So if I wanted to grab a class, say, so I want to give this a background color. So I just gave the footer a class of alert success. It turns a green, makes it 100%. All the class definitions are on the Bootstrap website. I don't pretend to be an expert with them. Mostly trial and error for me. I'm going to try this class, and if I break it, I undo and I try a different one. Yeah, there's lots in there.
So is that how you did the error then? You lit up the error red? You just did it like that?
Yeah, we'll do it. So that's exactly what I did here, in fact. So I use Bootstrap. If I inspect the element, yeah, there's the class. I use alert danger, right? So it's defined here. If you go to getbootstrap.com and I went into examples/theme, it shows you a number of them. So if you find a class you want to use, to get the footer right now, I couldn't remember what it was called, so I just right-clicked, I chose inspect, and it shows me that it's alert success. So I just try out the class, see if I like it. If it works, if not, I try something else. So that's really how I put this together. So when we add the validation, if we've got Bootstrap linked into our master page, we can just apply one of those error or danger classes onto our messages, and it'll do the styling for us. So typically what I think I'll do in most classes now is that the Bootstrap links are on Blackboard. So most classes I'll create a basic master page and throw the Bootstrap links into the headers, and at least we can use some basic classes just so our applications look at least a little bit better. Then you can take and do what you want with them.
Did you add anything else other than that? Because I added that in and it broke my code.
Okay, are you getting an error message?
Yeah.
What does the error message say?
After backslash
tried what he had to. That's why.
What does the error say?
Handled exception at line 6, COMP2007 and attached Bootstrap and Bootstrap in 3.4 thing. So you get the same error even after it's flat.
And you've put it inside the header,
Yeah.
but not inside the ASP content placeholder. Peter, notice mine on the screen? Okay. Got to be before or after, doesn't matter, but not inside of that tag.
So I'm not, okay, I'm already not inside of that tag.
Well, take it out. Take out those lines, save your file, make sure it loads, and then you can try and paste them in again. Maybe when you copied it, perhaps you missed an opening or closing bracket in one of those tags. You may just not have quite copied the full thing. So for your assignment, you'll need to include, even though your assignment's only one page, I still want to see that you've used a master page. Okay? It's a single page. You still have to build it as a web form with master page and create a master page with a basic header and footer. You don't have to get carried away. I mean, that's my header.
It's just IE.
There's my footer. No big deal.
I think it's just Internet Explorer.
Okay?
It works in Chrome.
So, are there any other questions about using the master pages? Sure.
Could you just go over to default for HTML?
Sure. In the C# or the HTML?
HTML.
Yep.
And just scroll over a little bit. Okay, never mind. I thought I was missing something on the end of the
Okay.
tag there, but never mind.
So we just have to make sure that all of our content is inside of an ASP content block, or we're going to get that yellow error screen I got when I first tried to apply the master page at the top. And if we want to change the master page, well, you can just change the file name right here. Right? I have different templates. I want to change the template of the page. I can just change that from lesson 4 to something else. And it'll inherit all the code and all of the HTML from whatever master page I assign. So we're not stuck that it has to be that master page if we want to make changes. Okay, so the other thing we'll do, and we have plenty of time to do this, we've got this blank tip page. Right now we don't really have anything going on. So what we're going to build is a really simple tip calculator. Kind of be a mini version of the assignment. We'll give the user a couple inputs. We'll give them a calculate button that will perform a calculation, display the results, and we'll also play around with the ASP.NET validation. And as I said, Visual Studio, it does most of it for us. They're basically drag and drop, set the properties, let Visual Studio and the .NET compiler write all the script for us. Okay. So all we want on our tip calculator, we're going to put 3 objects on. We're going to put a text box on, where the user can enter the amount of their bill, their bar bill, their restaurant bill. We'll add a simple drop-down list with 3 options, 10%, 15%, 20%, and we'll build a calculate button. It'll calculate the amount of the tip, and it'll calculate and display also the total amount of the bill. Once we have that working, we can add on the validation, play around with the validation controls. All right, we have plenty of time to do this before the end of class today. So I'm going to open up tip, and I'm going to go into content 2, because everything in the first ASP in content 1 is the head section. In fact, we don't even really need that. We could just delete that ASP content tab. We're not putting anything in it. So I'm actually just going to get rid of it. So I'll put on a div, and actually I can use a Bootstrap class. Why not?
Get rid of the head.
Yep, we don't need it. So I'll create a div. And we'll put on a label that says bill amount. Up to you whether you want to apply the classes. It doesn't matter. I'm going to apply the classes to mine, use some Bootstrap formatting. You don't have to. So we'll just add on a text box. TXT amount. And we'll set the required attribute. So the user can type in that box. And then we'll put on a section that will contain a drop-down list. And our drop-down list, we'll just hard code in the options. Whoops. So we'll give it an ID of DDL%. So we want 3 options here. The text on the options will say 10%, 15%, 20%. But the values will actually want to store the mathematical equivalents. So that'll make it easier for us to do a calculation. So rather than storing the values as text, we'll actually store the numbers that we would use when we calculate the tip. So we'll add on 3 ASP list item tags. So the first one, we'll give it a value of 0.1. Text of 10%. And we'll want 2 more options, one of them that's 15%, one of them that's 20%. And let's make the second option selected because 15% is fairly standard. That's usually the default. If people like their service, they'll tip more. If they don't, they'll tip 10. But generally 15 is pretty standard. So for the second one, second option, I'll add the selected equals true. So when our page loads for the first time, it will default to 15%.
Is there a reason why it has the required under text box?
Yeah, it's an HTML5 attribute. Actually, you know what? That's a good point. We're going to use the .NET validators instead, so I'm actually going to take it out. Thank you, Mike. So our last option, the value is 0.2, and the text is 20%. And then we'll just put on a button. I'll give it an ID of BTN calculate. So when they click that button, we'll take the value from the text box, we'll multiply it by the selected value in the drop-down, and we'll display both the amount of the tip and then the total, the tip plus the bill combined. This is really not all that different from your assignment. This is just kind of a mini version of it, really. If we look at the page in the browser now, here's what we get. Text box, tip percentage, calculate button that at the moment doesn't really do anything. Submits our form, doesn't do anything.
So calculate in the div.
Why is there 2 X's on top of it every time
Pardon?
Top right corner, the two X's. Check.
It's giving me a CSS error. Doesn't like something in. Oh, it doesn't like this. Okay, I'm going to take out, right. If I'm going to use the Bootstrap JavaScript file, I should also include a link to jQuery. So I have two ways to fix this. I can link to either a local or jQuery file or the live jQuery file, or I could just remove this line from my master page. We really don't need this for today. Actually, no, we do need this. The .NET validators are going to use jQuery. So in order to get the validation to work, I'm glad you brought that up, Kyle, we will have to link to the jQuery file. We'll do that shortly.
And up this way.
Yep, and we'll have to update Blackboard, absolutely. So first, let's write the code to do the calculation, and then we'll add the validations in. Whoops, actually, we can't do it yet. We have to put out a couple of, we have to create a couple controls for displaying the results. So above here, I'll maybe put on a title. I'll just put on an H4 tag that basically lets the user know this is the input section of the page. And then down below my button, I'll put on another heading that will basically be where the outputs display. So we'll put on a label, call it LBL tip. And we'll use this control to show how much the tip is. So that'll display the result of our first calculation. We'll just print it out to the screen. And then we'll need a second div below that with a label to hold the total, where we can add the tip onto the bill amount and display that in our other label. We've got an input section at the top and an output section at the bottom, much like on my sample solution for assignment 1. So all we really need to do now is go into Design View, double-click our button so Visual Studio will write the event handler, the click event handler for us. And then in the click event handler, we can do the calculation and display the results. Once that's working, we have some time, we'll add some validation to this. So if I double-click my button in the designer, we'll get a click event handler. So the first thing we're going to have to do is just do a simple calculation of the tip. So we may as well store that value into a variable, because we're then going to need to use that value in the calculation of the total. So I can create a variable called tip. What data type should we use for that, do you think? Could use float, we could use double. The other common one in C#, if we're going to have numbers that aren't whole numbers, would be a decimal number. So what does our calculation look like? How do we figure the tip? Kyle?
value that's in the textbook multiplied by the selected, I think we did ID or value.
Okay. Well, we can see that's where those prefixes help, right? I type txt, brings up my only text box. So txt amount dot text times, we called it DDL for drop down. Which attribute do we want to access of our drop down list?
Selected value.
You're right. Why do we want the value and not the text?
The text is just a string.
Right. The text is a string that includes the % sign. It's not numeric, so we're not going to be able to perform a mathematical calculation. So it's our text box text times our drop down selected value. Visual Studio's not happy. So if I mouse over, what's the issue, Brandon?
You have to convert the text amount dot text into a decimal.
You got it. We can see right in gray, we can see that it says if both of these are considered strings. So we can't use a multiplication operator. So we're going to have to convert each value individually first to a decimal, and then we can multiply the two decimals together. So C# has a number of data type conversion functions. They all start with convert dot. In this case, we're going to convert each value to a decimal. So we're converting that text to a decimal, and we have to do the same thing with our tip percentage. And now our compiler's happy. No more red squigglies. So convert each value to a decimal, then multiply them and store the result. Keep in mind on your assignment, a few of the calculations you're going to have to do, most of them you'll be dealing with whole numbers, like the total number of wins, the total number of losses. Each of those will be a whole number between 0 and 4. But things like the winning percentage or the average number of spectators, you want to use decimals instead of integers there, because those may not be whole numbers.
Is there a round function?
Yes. There's a math.round function. So now we've got our tip being calculated. How can we put that value back onto our page? Where should the value go, and how do we use the server-side script to send that value back to the user interface?
Just set the text of the labels.
You got it. So we just set the text of LBL tip. Well, we're close. We have to convert it back to a string. We actually have two ways to do this. We can use, there is a convert.toString. You notice if I type convert.to, we have a whole bunch. We can basically convert anything to anything. You know, there's a whole bunch of these.
How did you pull that up when there's already text in it? Never been able to figure it out.
Okay, if you have an object and there's already a dot, if I just highlight the dot and hit dot again to replace it, it brings it back. Brings that context menu back. Okay. So if you try something and it doesn't work, and you think, oh, I have to access a different property or different method because the one I tried didn't give me the result I want, highlight it with the cursor, or delete the dot if you delete it, and just replace it. So we can call convert.toString. Because that's by far the most common conversion, they put a shortcut in. So we could call convert.toString tip, or pretty much any variable just has a toString method. It's a shortcut. So I'm just going to call tip.toString. They're equivalent. You can use either one. I'm always in favor of less typing rather than more. So why not just call the .toString method? It's going to be shorter. So let's try this and see how it works. Make sure that at least our tip is being calculated and displayed properly. So if we recompile our solution, load the tip. Seems to work, okay. Now, we probably want to make sure that it's not rounding decimals when we should have them. So it seems to be working pretty much as we want it to.
On your two-string, you can pass in a C parameter. Double quotes for currency.
Thank you. Notice on toString, thanks for mentioning that, Mike, it says, this is one of the other things that are nice. A lot of the methods in .NET are overloaded, right? So we have a default toString method with no parameters, which doesn't do any conversion. Here, if we provide a format, it will try to format our string according to that certain format definition. So if we use and there's 3 other signature, actually I think it's this one we're using, string format. So in this case, if we provide a C, that stands for currency. This should format that as currency for us. I don't even have to refresh, it'll just reload. And now it gives us currency. So it's always going to round it to give it 2 decimals and do the currency conversion. So that's simple as formatting a value as currency. We'll take a decimal, it's always going to be a decimal number, or an integer we'll call toString, and we can just pass in that C as our optional parameters. So there's other options besides C. D, I believe, will give you a date format, and there are a number of other string formats. So we're partway there. That gives us the tip. Our total field's still blank. Yeah, so we're going to need this again. So we could save ourselves a step. If we wanted to put this in a variable the first time, we don't have to do the conversion again. So up to you whether you would want to create a variable called amount that was equal to the converted to decimal. We'll just do it. Oh, so I'll create a decimal called total, which is equal to tip plus, and I'll just convert it again. So we'll add the tip on to the original amount of the bill. And again, as Daniel explained, we're going to have to convert total back from a decimal back to a string in order to output it, and we can apply the currency formatting. So this is handy. By the time you're done today, you can upload this to Azure. You can bookmark this on your phone the next time you go out for dinner. You don't need to pull up the calculator, build the built-in calculator app on your smartphone. You can say to your friends, hey, I've got an online mobile-friendly tip calculator. We can just punch it in there. Right? So we'll build. So now it'll give us the total plus the tip, nicely formatted as currency. Okay. We can do this. So once we put this up on Azure, you should be able to easily do this with your phone. Now, there's one thing we haven't done. Easy to break. How do I break it?
Putting it in strings.
Oh, that's it.
That'll do.
Letter.
So, we want to do a couple of things. We want to make sure that the field is required. We also want to validate the data type. Right? We want to make sure that they've entered a number. We also want to make sure that that number is greater than 0. So there's several things we can do. So it used to be, before .NET came along, we'd had to write JavaScript to validate all this stuff, or we'd have to write server-side script to validate it and send the whole form to the server. So what we want to do is set our project up to use the built-in .NET validators, which will write JavaScript basically using jQuery. Okay. So what we're going to need, and our Bootstrap JavaScript link is complaining, saying you need to have a jQuery link. So we better go and include a link to jQuery as well, and then we can use the built-in validation tools that come with Visual Studio. So I'll just go and grab a jQuery CDN link. I'll put it into that in Blackboard. So I'll just go back into Blackboard, I'll edit this, and we'll also add. Now this needs to happen before the Bootstrap jQuery. So bear with me for a second and I will update this. We just wrap it in a link tag, in a script tag. Okay, so if you can go back to Blackboard, go back in. You can either grab that entire section and paste over what's in our master page, or you can just grab the jQuery link. This has to go above the Bootstrap jQuery link. It can't go after. We're still going to get that error that Kyle, you pointed out the browser's showing us. So I'm just going to copy this, go back to my master page, and before this latest compiled and minified JavaScript, I'm going to paste in my link to jQuery. This should make that red X go away now. That error saying Bootstrap's JavaScript requires jQuery, that should be gone. So if I reload now, yeah, so that error goes away.
jQuery before.
That's just because you have the other option there.
It's because I have the web developer toolbar installed in Firefox that you're seeing that. I've manually installed this because I use this all the time. So let's look at how the navigation controls work. So we'll go back to tip. They could not make this easier. Okay. So what we want to do is put a series of validators beside our text box. Right? The drop down is basically idiot proof. We already have a default. There's no way a user can have an option not selected.
You'd be surprised.
Well, if you can figure out how to get around picking a tip or picking one of those options, something other than those three options, you're a lot smarter than me. You may be smarter than me anyway.
No.
But I think we did pretty well here. I don't think we really need to validate this part.
What if you just hit paste?
And if anyone does, they're probably a developer.
Probably. So I'm going to go to my toolbox.
Either they're a developer or they just managed to screw up so badly.
And inside the toolbox, there's a validation section. So Visual Studio gives us several different validators. There's a required field validator, which we'll use. There's a range validator, which we're going to use. There's also a compare validator. So this is great for things like password and confirm. We can just drag on a compare and say, Make sure that the value of password is equal to the value of confirm, and if not, generate JavaScript to show a message and not submit the form. Or if we have start and end date, we might want to make sure the end date is not earlier than the start date, so we can compare two controls together. And we can decide what operator we're using. Equals, not equals, greater than, less than. So the first, and we also have regular expressions for things like validating email formats, postal codes, phone numbers.
What's a pointer?
I do not know what a pointer is. So let's use, I'm going to drag on a a required field validator. I'm just going to put it underneath my text box. And we can examine some of the properties. So by default, it gets an ID. The IDs, we don't really have to rename these to friendly IDs. The IDs don't matter. Gives it a run at equals server. It sets out a default error message that says required field validator. We probably want to change that. What do you want that message to say if they leave out the Okay, so please enter bill amount. You could just put an asterisk that shows up if we want. And now we can use one of the classes from Bootstrap for styling that message. If we give it an attribute of CSS class, I'm just going to pick alert danger. Actually, I think I want alert space alert danger. That'll give it that red background and red bold font. The other thing we have to set up, we have to say what control. Each validator can only validate one control. We can't use one required field validator for 20 different text boxes. So if we have 20 required text boxes, we'll need 20 of these controls. So what control are we validating? Our txt amount. So check this control for a blank value. If you find it, display this message and style it using this class in our style sheet.
The only reason you put it next to the input is so that when it shows the error message, it's...
Yep, I could put it wherever I wanted. There is a control on here called a validation summary. So maybe you want to set out a section above your form and you want to print all of the errors there. If you could put a validation summary on, and it will choose to display them there. So we have full control over where this displays. So now if we go back to our tip calc, so we haven't written any code. All we did was drag this thing on and set the properties. Well, that's pretty good. All right. And as I type, if I hit tab, it automatically rechecks it as soon as the blur event happens. So Visual Studio actually wrote a bunch of JavaScript for this. So here it is. It uses jQuery, the unobtrusive validation mode, and it writes the jQuery for us. Okay, so we haven't had to write any script at all. Oh, there is an error it doesn't like. It's working. It's asking us to add something into our web.config. Add a script resource mapping to name jQuery, which is case sensitive. So it's actually working, but our source is throwing this sort of under the hood structural error. We can fix this. So I'm going to open up web.config. And inside of configuration, where is it inside of system.web? Bear with me for a minute. I have to remember what I'm doing. I'm just going to grab this message. There is a quick fix inside of web.config that we need to make that'll make this go away. Here's what we need. So inside of our web.config, we're going to create an app settings section. App settings are any custom variables or global settings we want for the application. So any user-defined application settings. So we're going to add a setting, and it has to be called this: validation settings, unobtrusive validation mode. And I think our value is none, if memory serves. Oops, sorry, that's not a name. This should be a key. We'll try it this way. I may have to play around with it a little bit. Yep. So I added this entire section, these 3 lines, lines 12, 13, and 14. I'm not entirely sure this is our fix, but we're going to try. There are a few different ways to set this up. So I'm going to try again. Yeah, that does fix it. That error goes away. So now we can see there's our post back that handles the form submission. And here's where the JavaScript gets rendered. Required field validator 1 is checking our content. There's our error message. So it writes the JavaScript for us. So if our validation is active, meaning no validation errors were triggered, submit the form, basically. So the required field validators are as simple as dragging them, dropping them on the form, setting the properties, and making sure we've added this one line. So it's unobtrusive validation mode is the value. So there's how we can validate that a field's required. It's still breakable, though, right? I can't do this anymore. That's good. So we can use one of the other validators for this. So I'll just go on to a new line. If we use the range validator, that's going to allow us to check not only the data type of the user's entry, but it will also let us specify a range, meaning, for example, we can say that's a number, but if we only check for a number, they could enter -10. So not only we want to make sure it's a number, we want to make sure that number is greater than 0. So we'll set up some of the properties. So what should we do if they enter anything other than a positive number? We need to set up, first of all, the error message. And we'll say greater than 0. So that'll be one property we'll set up. What other property should we set? So it's got, if it's a range validator, built in, it's got a minimum and a maximum. So we need to set both. So our minimum should be 1 cent. Our maximum, we have to specify some kind of maximum or we'll get an error. So we'll just set something ridiculously high. Like that'll work. We can't leave it blank with a range validator. These two are both required. So we've given it a minimum, we've given it a maximum. There's a couple of other properties we need to set. What about for formatting? We've got the error message. We'll want to set the class here as well. We'll use that same alert danger. So it'll look just like our other error message. The last thing we want to specify, actually there's two more. We have to say what control we're checking again. So we'll say, so it's our txt amount. Here's the control to validate. And the last thing we want to set is the type. So here's where we can enforce data typing. So in this case, we'll pick a double. We won't make the user enter a $sign. Probably currency would work as well. We don't want integer, because integer will ignore decimals, right? So we'll probably want to use a double. And notice there was also a date data type. So if you want to give somebody a text box for a date, we can use the validator to ensure we're getting a valid date. So we've set up a whole bunch of properties, but trust me, that's easier than trying to write the JavaScript to do this work for you. So if I enter,
It shows up to the right.
why does it show up over there? We can change that because we've already allocated space. By default, when you put the validators on, the space is already allocated for them, but we can change that so that no space is allocated unless the validator is visible. If we look at the element, it just renders as a span tag. So by default, we can make it so that no space has been allocated for it. And if I enter, so if I enter 1, 2, 3, goes 1, 3, it goes away. But if I put in, it's back. And as long as that's showing up, my form submission gets canceled. That's not going to work. So if we just want to fix where it displays, there's one other property we can set. These validators have a display property that by default are set to static, meaning the space for it's already been allocated. If we change that to dynamic, they will always show up immediately right beside the control. So I don't need to make this one dynamic. The required field validator already is in the right spot. But our range validator is not where we want it to be. By changing this display from static to dynamic, whoops, I have to make both. I do have to make both of them dynamic, sorry, because the range the required is still taking up space. We don't want it to take up any space unless it's visible. My mistake. So we do need to set the display property to dynamic for both. So usually when I use these, I make them dynamic. So there's no space allocated unless they're visible. One more time. Take it out. They're in the same place. So these make life really easy for us to do validation. We don't really have to validate on the server, and we don't have to write JavaScript. We can format them however we want. We can display them wherever we want. They contain a lot of rich functionality. So you'll need to use these in your assignment. You'll need to check that all of the inputs are filled out, that none of them are blank. You'll need to make sure that you'll need the one we didn't use, there's also a compare validator that I mentioned, so that's what I used here. If I make scored and allowed the same, that compare validator is triggered. So you'll be able to figure out how to use that one pretty easily. You just set the properties to compare the two controls and make sure the values are equal.
If you set it to dynamic and two errors triggered like they are right now, it just puts them on top of each other.
Yes. Well, it only, in this case, it put them on top of each other because they're inside of this section, which is only so wide. If it wasn't inside this section, they would probably be beside each other.
So those are all in group boxes?
I used the Bootstrap class for this is called a well. I created a well so that it put a border around that group. So you can format it however you see fit. I mean, there's these kinds of groupings. You got lots of options in terms of how you present it.
Why is some of that?
It's just filler text. It's
No.
just Latin filler text. Okay. Does anybody have any other questions about anything we've done today? We've kind of did 2 lessons in one. So we're sort of caught up to where the Wednesday class is, which is good for you, because if you can't come on a Monday, now the Wednesday will sort of be back in sync, or closer in sync with you guys. Okay, they may still be a little bit ahead, but we haven't done the validation stuff in that Wednesday class. We'll be doing it this week. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll put these files up on Git. So if you don't have a copy, you can take a copy from Git. I'll also push it to Azure. If you don't have this working, try and get this all working, push it to Azure. Try this out on your phone. You should be able to use it. Pretty simple little tool for you. Okay. So I'll put this up and we'll see what happened with my screencast. If it actually worked for the latter part of class.
You gotta hit